In this history of WoW, we'll be looking over the history of the Druid's Moonkin Form. This form is associated with balanced specialization for Druids and is sometimes called the Boomkin or Boomie by the World of Warcraft community. To start this video off, we'll be discussing the lore of the Moonkin Form. Moonkins are a unique creation in WoW in that they only exist in other forms in the game Dungeons & Dragons, in which they're given the creative name of owlbears. The WoW version of this creature has a unique twist in the fact that the owlkin in WoW also have antlers, and so they're presumably part deer. In fact, the description of the Moonkin pet added in BFA has a description part owl, part bear, and part stag, which handily avoids potential lawsuits. The importance of this creature in relation to D&D is important to note because two of the major druid forms, the bear and cat forms, are directly borrowed from real-world animals. The fourth major druid form, the Trent form, is likely heavily influenced from the Ents in Lord of the Rings. The technical name for this form is called the Tree of Life, but most players only know it as the Tree form or Trent form. Now that we're done with the refresher on druid forms, let's move on to actually talking about moonkins. There are actually many different types of moonkins. The largest umbrella term category for the owlbears in WoW is the term wildkin, although they are also sometimes called owlkin in the game as well, and the term owlkin is also sometimes used to refer to a specific type of wildkin, which makes the term all the more confusing. The more feral and aggressive types of owlkins encountered in the wild are called owlbeasts, and they can be found in zones of Winterspring, Hillsbrad Foothills, and Val Shara. The specific type of owlbear, actually called the owlbear in WoW, is more peaceful and nature-loving than the owlbear's cousins. These are the wildkin that are associated with druids and night elves, and some of them can be found in zones of Darkshore, Mount Hyjal, and the hinterlands. There are two subspecies of wildkin in WoW as well, each specific to a certain zone. The first of these two are the owlkin, which are wildkin which have gone crazy on the Draenei starting zone in the Azure Mist Isle. These owlkin have turned into mutated owlkin because of the Draenei ship crashing. The second specific subspecies of wildkin can be found in the Legion zone of Stormheim. Here in the northern part of the zone, one can find the Raven Bears, which are wildkin with all black feathers. Owlkin have some sort of connection to Elune in nature, and it has not been entirely explained how or why in the game so far. What is known is that sometimes when cut from the light of Elune, wildkin may turn aggressive. Some wildkin are also called Boontouch when they turn aggressive, and it's not known if this is due to the lack of connection to Elune, or whether it's more akin to the Dark Warrior aspect of Elune. Night Elf tradition has it that wildkin are the creation of Elune and that she created them to guard all of her sacred places. But as Elune has gotten weaker, the wildkin have grown more aimless and feral. In the lore, wildkin are intelligent, and some are even said to understand the languages of the Night Elves. They live in societies and can craft tools and other primitive objects. Now that we know who and what moonkin are, we can discuss in length the history of changes to the moonkin form throughout all of WoW. We being at the beginning, of course, with Vanilla and its later iteration of Classic. The Moonkin form has been in World of Warcraft since its inception, Vanilla, and although it was nowhere near the best class spec in Vanilla, its reputation has steadily improved since then due to a handful of changes over the years. Moonkin form's abilities have remained pretty constant over the history of WoW. In Classic and Vanilla, the Moonkin form's ability cost 35% base mana to shapeshift into. This led to a plethora of problems right off the bat. As you can imagine, just the act of shapeshifting costing more than a third of a player's base mana before they even started casting spells was a severe hindrance. Just remember though, that intelligence would increase a druid's mana pool a bit, so they didn't literally lose a third of their mana with each transformation, but it still was quite a lot. While transformed, moonkins can only cast balanced spells. This means if you wanted to cast any other spells, you have to shapeshift out and back in again, which in Classic meant another 35% of your mana was instantly gone again. Balanced druids went through mana so quickly in early WoW that players started calling them oomkins, short for out of mana boomkins. On the bright side, there are three main benefits that the druids gain when they take on the Moonkin form of Vanilla. First, turn into a giant owlbear removes all polymorph and movement inherent effects. Second, while in Moonkin form, all the druid's armor is increased by 360%. Finally, Moonkin form grants a 3% critical spell chance increase to any party members within 30 yards of the player. The Moonkin form's first significant change came in the Burning Crusade, when the Moonkin form's attack power was increased by 150%. This was because the Moonkin form was so bad DPS-wise that it was given more melee defense for a caster class. Specifically, the armor bonus for Moonkin form was increased from 360% to 400%. Additionally, the Mana Star balance spec got a bit of a reprieve with two changes. First, the base mana cost to shapeshift into Moonkin form was reduced to 22% of base mana, a pretty big decrease down from 35% base mana cost in Vanilla. However, this was still a little under a quarter of the player's mana, and it still was a big deal to swap in and out of the shapeshifting forms while in combat. Also, while in Moonkin form, the druid's melee attacks have a chance to trigger Elune's Touch, which regenerated mana based on attack power, and don't forget that attack power was also buffed in the Burning Crusade. It seems the idea behind Moonkins by Blizzard was for them to be in and out of melee, casting spells to use their mana, and attacking in melee to get it back. However, they did absolutely pitiful melee damage, so it wasn't really properly balanced to work that way well. Lastly, in patch 2.5, Moonkin were given a regrowth bonus ability. When the players shifted out of Moonkin form, their next regrowth spell cost 450 less mana. Wrath of the Lich King saw 3 major changes to the Moonkin form. The Moonkin form in Wrath lost 2 of its major buffs added in the Burning Crusade. Both the increase in attack power and the Elun's Touch proc were removed when Wrath launched. However, these 2 losses were replaced with 2 other changes. First, the cost to shapeshift was reduced immensely in patch 3.1, becoming only 13% of base mana. Second, a new proc was added to replace Elun's Touch. This proc acted somewhat similarly in restoring a Druid's mana. Specifically, critical strikes at single target spells had a chance to restore 2% of the Druid's mana. The third and final change to the Moonkin form in Wrath came in patch 3.2.2, when the Moonkin form also reduced all damage taken by 15% when the player was stunned. This was presumably done since Boomies rely so much on spellcasting and had very few defensive mechanisms. There is one talent that affected the Moonkin form in Wrath that should be mentioned. The improved Moonkin form talent was added in Wrath and removed when Cata was released. This talent requires 34 points to activate and wasn't widely used since it was pretty bad. The improved Moonkin form had 3 ranks and affected the Moonkin Aura spell. When selected, the Moonkin's Aura caused friendly players to gain haste and the player to gain a percentage of their spirit as additional spell damage. However, the haste benefit was very small at only 1, 2, and 3% for each rank. Additionally, most PvP letter had very little spirit stats, so the increase of 10, 20, or 30% for each rank was also pretty weak. Now we move on to WoW's 3rd expansion. In the Cataclysm expansion, Moonkin form was given a buff so that all incoming damage by the player while Moonkin form was reduced by 15%. This seems to be an iteration on the Wrath 15% reduced damage while stunned, but applied to all forms of damage. However, to compensate for this big change and not make Boomies too OP, Blizzard decided to remove all the armor that came with the Moonkin form. Additionally, while in Moonkin form, Arcane and Nature spell damage were increased by 10%. Finally, Moonkin form increased the spell haste of all party members by 5%. Mists of Pandaria saw a complete rework to the talent system, and Balanced Druid was no exception. The mana cost of shapeshifting was completely removed in the direction of the glyph of the Master Shapeshifter. Although by this point in WoW's history, they had kind of removed mana being a resource for most spellcasters. In patch 5.4, the Cataclysm changes to Moonkin were completely reverted. This meant that the armor Moonkin form was returned to an increase of 60%, but it also meant that the 15% damage reduction was removed. This 60% armor increase was then changed to a 100% increase a little while later. One small addition in Mists of Pandaria was the ability for Druids to ride mounts while in Moonkin form. Visually, most mounts revert the player back into their original caster form, but at least Druid players no longer had to waste mana to mount up. The final change in Mists of Pandaria was a small one, which means that the player can only benefit from the 5% spell haste while in Moonkin form as long as within 100 yards of the player. WoW's next expansion, World of Draenor, saw a few changes to the Moonkin form. With this simplification of haste and WoD, the Moonkin form was changed from granting a small spell haste buff to instead granting a small mastery buff. Specifically, instead of granting 5% increase to spell haste, Moonkin form now granted a 5% buff to mastery. World of Draenor also saw the introduction of Draenor perks. 2 of these perks affected Moonkin form, and both of these talents were removed with the launch of Legion. The first of these removed talents from the WoD expansion was called Enhanced Moonkin form. The Draenor perk was a passive talent that increased the Moonkin's form armor by an additional 100%. WoD also had another Draenor perk called Empowered Moonkin, which added the passive ability for single target attacks against the player in Moonkin form to have a 15% chance to make the next damaging spell instant cast. Many big changes to the Moonkin form came in the Legion expansion. First, a new passive effect was added, so that while in Moonkin form causes single target attacks against the Druid to have a 50% chance to make the next damaging spell instant, mirroring the similar Draenor perk. Second, the Moonkin form was once again given even more armor for a total of 200% increase to armor. To balance this out, Blizzard reversed their decision for World of Draenor and removed the Mastery passive, although this was also where they were kind of just removing these random passives that every class brought in order to more homogenize which classes could bring buffs to raids. In 7.1, the 15% chance to make the damaging spell instant was removed and replaced with a passive ability that made single target attacks against the player, while in Moonkin form have a 100% chance to make their next Lunar Strike, Solar Flare, or Stellar Flare instant. In 7.1.5, this was changed to only be Lunar Strike. The final big change to the Moonkin form in Legion was that it finally got a model update. As a Dragonflight, this is the only time in the history of the game that the form has gotten a new model. WoW's 7th expansion, Battle for Azeroth, once again saw several changes to the Moonkin form. First, the 200% armor increase was brought back down to 125%. However, all spells now gained a 10% increase in damage as opposed to just nature and arcane spells. In Shadowlands, there was a passive rank 2 of the Moonkin form, which made it so single target attacks against the Druid had a 15% chance to make the next Starfire instant. This harkens back to the original iteration of the ability in Legion. However, this passive ability was removed with the talent system overhaul in Dragonflight. Currently in Dragonflight, the base Moonkin form grants 3 benefits. It increases all spell damage by 10%, it makes the player immune to polymorph effects, and it increases armor by 125%. As you can tell, Blizzard has a hard time balancing the balance spec, with most of their smaller changes being more of a tit-for-tat exchange for various different stats while in the Moonkin form. The Moonkin form has had many changes over the years, with most of them being small adjustments over the expansions regarding the player stats in the Moonkin form, like how much the Moonkin form increased the player's armor percentage by. Before we move on to all of the current abilities that affect Moonkin form, there is one removed PvP talent that we should mention. This passive ability was called Iron Feather Armor, and existed in PvP as a talent for 2 expansions, Legion and Battle for Azeroth. Iron Feather Armor's description read, Moonkin form increases your armor by an additional 25%. And reduces your chance to be critically hit by melee attacks by 20%. It additionally added 50% armor when it was added in 7.1, but Blizzard decided this was too OP and nerfed it to 25% shortly after. As of Dragonflight, there are currently 3 talents in the game that affect the Moonkin form. The first of these talents is called Incarnation Chosen of Elut. This talent slightly changes the appearance of the Moonkin form to make it appear to have more armor, so a Boomkin can pretend to be a tank for a couple of seconds until they die. This talent replaces the Celestial Alignment spell and is instant cast. The spell's description reads, an improved Moonkin form that grants the benefits of Celestial Alignment and 10% critical strike chance. The player also receives a buff that says, both eclipses active. Haste increased by 10% and critical strike by 10%. However, this improved Moonkin form only lasts 30 seconds and has a 3-minute cooldown. On the positive side, you can shapeshift in and out of this improved Moonkin form for its duration. This talent is also worth noting because it's one of 2 different ways to alter the appearance of the Moonkin form. The extra armor is a little visually different, but not too exciting or unique. The next talent in the game that affects Moonkin form is called Master Shapeshifter. This is a unique talent in the fact that it's only available to the Guardian, Restoration Druid specializations. However, it affects their Moonkin form when they swap into it, so it should be mentioned that it changes the basic Moonkin form. When a Guardian or Restoration Druid chooses the Bounce Affinity and the Master Shapeshifter talent, they both gain the same effect. When they enter Moonkin form, their cast number of the Wrath and Starfire is reduced by 30%, and the damage of Wrath and Starfire is increased by 20% for 10 seconds. The Master Shapeshifter talent was also added in Legion and was first only available to the Guardian specialization, but the Restoration specialization also gained access to the talent in BFA. The next talent is called Moonkin Aura. An ability called Moonkin Aura existed from Classic to Legion, and it increased the party member's spell crit by 3%, as long as they remained within 30 yards of the player. The new iteration of the Moonkin Aura ability was added in Legion and is a PvP talent. This ability relies on the Star Search spell. When a Boomie casts Star Surge, it grants 4% spell critical chance to 8 allies within 40 yards for 18 seconds, and it stacks up to 3 times. Now that we've discussed all of the major changes to Moonkin form, let's move on to talking about the different Moonkin appearances. There is only one glyph in the game currently that changes the appearance of the player's Moonkin form. This glyph from Cataclysm is called the Glyph of Stars, and it changes the Moonkin form to something more of an ethereal and celestial, making the Moonkin appear all starry. This form is fittingly called the Astral Moonkin form. The final appearance change of the Moonkin form is that each Druid race has a unique Moonkin color scheme. The Night Elves have a Moonkin form with purple and white feathers. The Tauren has a Moonkin form that is brown and white and looks similar to an owl. Trolls could become Druids in Cataclysms, and they had black and brown feathers. Worgen were also added as Druids in Cataclysm, and they have a color scheme of white and black feathers and retain more lupin ears. Added in BFA, the 2 allied races of the Kulturan humans and Zandalari trolls could be playable as Druids, and they also receive special Moonkin forms. Kulturans have a special wicker and wooden-themed scarecrow-like Moonkin form appearance, and the Zandalari Druids have a unique upright pterodactyl-type Moonkin appearance. 3 Horde races that can be Druids also have some small cosmetic changes while in Moonkin form. Tauren, High Mountain Tauren, and Darkspear Trolls retain their horns, antlers, and tusks, respectively, when they shapeshift into Moonkin form. Although High Mountain Tauren were added in Legion, it wasn't until patch 8.1 that the High Mountain had the antlers in Moonkin form. The Moonkin form has the fewest changes by far to any of the Druid shapeshifting forms, and this will be the first of 4 videos for each of the Druid shapeshift forms. There are some other spells that have been removed from the game that affect Moonkin form, like the Alkin Frenzy talent, but they were more indirect and didn't feel the need to include them since they didn't change the Moonkin form, but more of the player's stats. And the main focus of the video is on the Moonkin form itself. So next time you see a Boomkin, be sure to pat them on the back now that you know they've only had 1 model update and only 1 cosmetic option, as opposed to the other Druid forms which have many more cosmetic options.